kind elderly dog was just relaxing in his backyard sunlight in a peaceful suburban area until 2. When police arrived, what began as a normal check turned into something unjust and upsetting for the helpless dog. But just when it seems that this elderly puppy had no one to protect him, the entire argument was turned upside down when his owner appeared. How could a devoted old dog cause such a disturbance? And the reason these officers crossed the line Winters has been with his beloved German for almost 12 years. Duke, a gray-muzzled shepherd mix, loved warm days. Their placid suburban life appeared perfect, the kind of tranquil existence where they could sleep by the garden fence. Local children rode their bikes until nightfall, and neighbors waved hello. Then one terrible. Duke was regarded as elderly in dog years on the day that peace was broken. Mark had gone out for errands expecting no shocks, and usually napped in the middle of the day on a patch of sunlight grass. He never thought that when he returned, 2 policemen would be standing over his dog. Their voices caused tension to rise and crackle in the. A neighbor who was listening to the chaos saw the scene via a window. She was startled to see an elderly dog hiding close to the fence while uniformed officers shouted orders while displaying a sense of. Duke's only response to the apparent disproportionate power was a low, pathetic. Words rapidly spread as he whined, his weary eyes displaying fear and confusion. The police are harassing Mark's elderly dog. Duke, who is feared by several in the neighborhood, was being accused of being hostile or bothersome, and by the time Mark's automobile arrived, some were concerned about possible animal abuse. Drew up, the scene showed a cowardly bleak Duke squeezed up against the fence, shuddering beneath the officer's stern gestures. A witness told the police what in the world had caused this spectacle. Had yet to receive an anonymous complaint on a hazardous dog that was wandering the yards. Duke hardly walked, as seen by his hazy eyes and wobbly legs. Mark's heart raced with rage and protectiveness when he noticed his food bowl, which was now more than a few steps away. When his old friend was cornered, he got out of his car with a rush of adrenaline and a resolve to protect Duke and the officers. Whirled around, unsure of Mark's reaction, eyes darting from man to dog at. The stage was prepared for a confrontation at that point that would not only disclose the reason for the call, but also question presumptions regarding authority, loyalty, and the silent power of an elderly gray-muzzled dog who was content to just nap in the sun. Did anyone anticipate that the subsequent events would compel all neighbors, including Mark himself, to call the police? Mark Winters was barely able to rethink the boundaries between caution and harassment, as well as between dread and compassion. He couldn't believe what he saw. His beloved dog Duke, who had been laying in the sun most of his life, was now standing. He was shaking in his own lawn when 2 police officers in uniform confronted him. Mark felt that the voices were too loud and that there was a noticeable tension in the air. Duke's muzzle was frosty. The last word anyone would use to describe him was scary because he was gray and his joints had become stiff over the years. However, he was pressed up against the fence here, seemingly surrounded by an unknown threat. As soon as Mark got out of his car, the officers whipped their heads around, looking at him with fatigue. In Duke, Mark rushed across the field while his heart continued to race. Yard, what's happening? Attempting to maintain composure in his voice despite. One cop, a tall, broad-shouldered man, answered as his rage rose inside him. Recently, we received a complaint regarding a hazardous dog that was running around the neighborhood, keeping one hand close to his utility belt, which caused Mark's stomach to turn over in anxiety. The officer's companion, who was a little shorter, looked at Duke with obvious. Mark shook his head uneasily, his face showing perplexity. He's dangerous, he's ancient. Duke released a gentle, pathetic whine, and he seldom ever leaves this place now. Paws digging into the grass. This wasn't a dog snapping or snarling if anything. Duke was the one being tormented by 2 uniformed strangers who towered over him in hostile position. Mark found the entire picture to be ridiculous and unnerving as it attempted to dissipate the scene. Mark walked carefully toward Duke, squatting down, and said in a calm voice, "Hey buddy, it's okay," whispered as he stroked a hand along Duke's back, feeling the ancient. The tall officer scowled. "Sir, please take a step back. The dog's heart is pounding more quickly than usual, but nobody will harm you. We must evaluate this dog because we were told that he may have snapped at someone." Mark's eyes tightened as he snapped at the person. He could hardly stand on his own 2 feet most of the time, although he occasionally saw a neighbor and Miss R. Flanagan looking out from behind her curtain. She gestured empathetically, as if to convey that she had seen enough to conclude Duke was not a threat. We received a complaint from a neighbor regarding an aggressive dog that was barking, and it crossed the shorter officer's face. He paused while pursuing children, looking at Duke's unsteady stance to see if there was a mix-up. Mark sighed in anger, realizing that Duke has never pursued this mix-up. Maybe he got the incorrect location, but the tall officer stood up. No one in his life, not even a squirrel, is there anymore. Crossed, we called him back. The address matched, and we saw he was free. The yard and reacting violently when we got there. Mark repeated his voice sharply, saying he's elderly, and there was an awkward hush as the taller cop appeared to be frightened by the strangers shouting at him in his own property, afraid to own up to a mistake, while his companion became noticeably uncomfortable as if he realized that things weren't as stated. That in an attempt to soothe the frightened dog, Mark massaged Duke's ears once more. Mark kept pushing himself to remain steady after you two broke into private property on a poor tip, and now you're going all out. The tall officer's jaw clenched instead of acknowledging that he might have been mistaken. Sir, lower your voice, he said, his tone harsh, with authority, yet Mark detected a tinge of defensiveness behind it. Mark shot back, just doing our job is fine, but part of your job is to know when there's no real threat. A neighbor over the fence gave him a short, agitated glance as he pointed to Duke, whose rib cage rose, commented that Duke has been around for ages and is incredibly gentle. How certain are you that? Not confusing him with that new large stray that has been about. The police looked over in surprise at what they saw. Voice, but none of them was able to fully see the neighbor, so he decided to talk while. Reluctant to become overly engaged, but determined to protect Duke's reputation. They are partially concealed behind a fence. Curiosity can spread like wildfire in a suburban neighborhood, and soon a small group of people gathered close to Mark's. Some shouted their comments, and others recorded the interaction on their phones. The stress increased with each passing day. He is an elderly dog. Let him alone. Perhaps the cops shouldn't abuse helpless animals. Duke let out a low, melancholy wail as he was overcome by the eyes and words. The senior officer appeared to comfort Mark as he put a comforting hand on his dog, Scruff, whispering, "Hang on, buddy. We'll fix this." Squirm at the increased attention, his body tensing as if he were afraid of losing command of the story. Seeing the change in popular opinion, the shorter officer cleared his throat. Perhaps we should confirm the dogs. Documents, sir, he recommended, trying a more subdued tone to demonstrate their vaccination license, which might. Mark nodded in an attempt to defuse the situation. So let me take his documents from within. Then glancing at the tall officer, he continued, "But Duke, you're staying right here with me. Don't have to deal with him." The tall officer stayed composed, but reluctantly moved aside to allow Mark to lead Duke. Duke's joints groaned with age as the two of them proceeded slowly toward the back entrance. Every time they made an attempt, bystanders moved aside to allow them to pass, whispering softly. Mark retrieved Duke's veterinary records and said, "Hang in there, old boy." He felt his rage turning to sadness as he read about Duke being tormented in his latter years in a dusty folder. Stung more than any insult, and upon his return, the officers checked the documents to confirm that Duke was completely. The shorter officer's eyes were microchipped, vaccinated, and licensed by the city. Darted empathetically from the pages to Duke's quivering figure, and once he confessed, he met his partner's eyes, seemingly urging the taller police to give in, pursed lips. A silence descended as the tall officer nodded suddenly, suggesting that there had been a mistake. The crowd phone was still up over the yard as they awaited the judgment. The tall officer stepped up and apologized for any mistake, but he said stiffly. His reserved tone revealed honesty. "And we received a complaint of a deadly dog." We responded to that presumption, and Mark managed a slight nod. "I get that you're performing your job, but perhaps the next time consider the..." The officer's jaw moved as if he wanted to argue, but the situation was better before frightening an elderly dog half to death. The dog's seeming frailty and the large number of witnesses seemed to sap his pride, and it was recognized that the two. A few neighbors mumbled disapproving remarks under their breath as the officers turned to flee the backyard. Miss. The departing officers stiffened when Flanagan gave them a gentle clap in mockery, but they remained silent when they were gone. Mark fell to one knee next to Duke, and the old shepherd mix swept over him like a tidal wave of comfort, released a trembling breath, and buried his muzzle in Mark's chest, whispering softly. Support rose from those who were still there. Wonderful guy, Duke, and he's now safe. However, Mark couldn't get rid of the picture of the policemen imposing voices, which would have been raised had the neighbors not called them out. If Mark had decided to defend Duke with renewed vigor at that precise time, the situation might have gotten out of hand, taken away some of the dog's mobility. But Duke was entitled to respect and tranquility in his own yard, regardless of what caused the. Mark promised that he would never allow the officer's overreaction and the false allegation to occur again. Maybe it was time to advocate for all gray people if the system required clarification on what constituted a genuine threat. Muzzled pal who didn't want to be intimidated and just wanted to sleep in the sun. After the officers left, some neighbors remained by the fence, creating an uneasy silence in the backyard. Duke G., who was still shivering a little, rubbed his muzzle into the eerie image while speaking in low tones. Mark's leg, as though to confirm that the experience was, in fact, behind him, stooped to massage the elderly shepherd's ears, experiencing a sense of comfort mixed with residual rage. A wiry-haired woman in Mrs. Flanagan, wearing a beige coat, walked forward with concern written in her face. Mark, are you both all right? She questioned in a quiet, urgent voice. Nodded, forcing a tiny, appreciative smile. Thank you for speaking up. We're all right now. Previously, the police's hostile posture had been diffused by the neighbors' prompt involvement, thanks to the recollection of. In the corner of the yard, Mr. Leonard, a long-standing resident with a nasty voice, continued to make Mark's stomach turn. Kane shook his head, shocked that they believed Duke posed a threat. Poor canines with arthritis and bones heard that alone strengthened Mark's sense of injustice. I'm sure he's never harmed anyone's soul. When they phoned the police, they either overstated or flatly lied, and by the following morning, reports of police intimidating an old dog had. Posts of the dog being cornered in his own yard went viral on social media groups in the neighborhood. While many expressed surprise that the cops had shown such animosity toward plainly non-threatening pet, while some were furious and demanded that the department take responsibility, while others conjectured who. Mark read through these texts with mixed feelings, maybe reporting Duke as hazardous. He liked the backing, but feared any negative reaction that could result from causing formal difficulties. He also questioned whether the complainant, who was sleeping by the living room, was either a new resident or someone who had a grudge against pets. Window periodically raising his head to observe Mark's pace. But the immediate danger had vanished, and Mark found himself. Duke used to look out the window more frequently, keeping an eye out for any patrol cars. Despite being carefree, he appeared cautious and stayed near to the house, as if worried that intruders could invade. Avoid the dog's anxiousness once more, which showed up as pacing and whimpering throughout sleepless nights. Mark had to get up around 2 in the morning, and he was frequently near the rear door. To reassure Duke that there was nothing dangerous outside, Mark thought about whether he should submit a complaint, because the entire experience felt wrong on many levels. Although he had previously admired law enforcement, he was anti-police after witnessing officers mistreat his innocuous old pet like. He was gravely shaken by a threat. Could these same officers treat another innocent person? Mark made the decision a few days later to either treat animals the same way or, worse, an actual person. Visit the neighborhood precinct in the hopes of resolving the matter, or at the very least finding out why the officers had reacted in such a. Mark's brief account was heard by the front desk officer when he arrived. Quickly vanished to locate a manager, and 20 minutes later, Mark was shown a small office where a lieutenant waited for him, his eyes weary and his smile contrite. After reviewing the phone logs, Mr. Winters, the landlord, started. An anonymous allegation claims that a dog that matches Duke's description is growling at children. Although the responding cops followed protocol, it appears from neighbor testimony that there was a significant miscommunication. Mark nodded, holding his chest tight. I don't mean to start a fight, but they didn't just. They swiftly escalated, cornering an elderly dog and screamed at him in accordance with protocol. That's unusual, and the lieutenant's face briefly regretted it. I know we're doing an internal review. He paused, picking his words carefully, suggesting that the call might have been a joke or overblown, are making efforts to rectify the officer's approach. But Mark was not totally happy. He felt that there was some sincerity. I understand that Duke is traumatized, and I don't want this to continue. To any other person or pet in the interim, some neighbors got together to discover who might have made that false call. One afternoon, Mrs. Flanagan cornered Mark while holding a printed. I asked some of the older residents about their street map, and none of them mentioned calling the police because a new family had moved there. Could they be the ones that were complaining about dog barking last week? Someone observed them grumbling about it 2 blocks over. Conjecture, but if someone had overreacted to a little barking, Mark briefly became irritated, particularly the sporadic moans of an elderly dog or whine that sounded excessive. Mark might have responded, but we can't be sure. I just hope they understand. The chaos they created, spurred by the fiasco, Mark started thinking about how to promote greater communication between local law enforcement and pet owners. The department might host a brief, kind behavior program that teaches cops how to differentiate between actual aggressiveness and a scared or old dog. He talked about the concept with Mr. Leonard and Mr. Flanagan, who both believed it may bring the community together. And by chance, a staff member from a nearby animal shelter contacted Mark online with an offer. Additionally, they told tales of dogs who were misreported or taken because of misconceptions, particularly bigger. The worker created a brief article regarding senior dog care, and we would love to highlight Duke in it. It might help folks see. Mark, a wary but gratified senior, consented to a brief interview. Duke's confidence in the yard returned as the week went on, despite the fact that the dog continued to exhibit signals of trepidation whenever strangers came near. Mark spent time every afternoon, sit outside with Duke, and let him enjoy the sun once more while comforting him with soft touches and soothing words. The dog's typical relaxed manner gradually replaced the lines of concern in his eyes, although there was still a sense of. That day in the backyard had shown Mark how fragile his dog's tranquility was, and consequently the mission grew in his heart. Danger is balanced between being cautious and going too far if one anonymous complaint may motivate officers. Would harass a helpless elderly dog. But what about situations where less fortunate or noticeable dogs were involved before Basie Mark had? He had been happy to let things unfold in silence, but now he was thinking about taking on a more active role, perhaps by promoting more transparent regulations or just telling the local media about Duke. He believed that by doing so, less. At the end of the day, animals and less owners would experience the same anguish as he massaged. Seeing the dog's weary eyes close in satisfaction and the graying of the duck's snout, Mark realized that championing the best possible end of the entire situation may be kindness and reason, and in that, Duke appeared to concur with the soft twilight calm, one contented sigh at a time. The disturbing altercation in Mark Winter's backyard with Duke, the elderly, occurred several weeks ago. He was no longer flinching every time, and the German Shepherd mix had regained most of his confidence. However, he remained apprehensive and attempted to proceed when he heard strange footsteps close to the fence. Mark, concentrating on his job and the routines of his life, but he couldn't help but wonder who had initially contacted the cops. Place continued to stare at him. One clear morning, Mark got his mail and discovered a typed note inside a simple white envelope without a return address. I apologize for what transpired. I only needed assistance with the situation and didn't intend for the cops to treat your dog so badly. Please comprehend that the stray has been frightening my children and that has gone too far. The most obvious hypothesis as to who wrote this was that it was the neighbor who was allegedly the one who filed the complaint. However, if this individual hadn't really meant to target Duke in particular, how had things gone out of hand? Mark read the. Observe how the statements sounded defensive and remorseful, suggesting that they still held. Although there was a valid worry that he was straying, it wasn't made clear why the call sent the police to his residence or how. At least they're sorry, he reasoned, even though the issue got out of hand. A few days later, Missy, Duke, is sniffing the envelope's corner and huffing softly, seemingly dissatisfied. Mark was raking leaves in his front yard when Flanagan dropped by, and I heard from the Jones family down the street that they claimed that yesterday night they spotted a big, mangy-looking stray prowling the alley. She asked whether it was the dog. Mark stopped leaning on the rake, and your neighbor said that perhaps that was the person the police were actually searching for. If so, it suggests that the call may have been real and that the caller mistook Juke for that stray. But why didn't they at least, before entering my yard, be sure? Mrs. Flanagan shrugged and shared his frustration. Regardless, there is undoubtedly another dog out there, and it is most likely not as elderly and kind as. That night, Mark was sitting on the back porch thinking about the possibility that a stray might actually be aggressive. He sympathized with the worried parent if a big dog was out and frightening children. Duke snored quietly at, "If only we could have resolved this amicably," Mark thought, his feet unaware of the whirlpool of emotions in his head. Instead, his old friend's minor grievance had turned into a near-tragic event, and then he heard a noise coming from beyond his gate. Duke's ears perked up when he heard a garbled growl or snarl, but he didn't move. But Mark got up to see and looked over the fence. He caught a glimpse of a slender, shadowy dog silhouette disappearing behind a trash can in the faint light of a nearby street lamp. It was a stray, and as soon as it realized Mark was around, it vanished. Determined to find out more about the alleged stray, Mark visited the local animal shelter the following morning. A young man called Peter, a volunteer there, recognized Mark's face from the local social media discussion around Duke's plight. "We've received several calls regarding a big, perhaps hostile stray that fits that description," and Peter stated that he's known to wander the alleys at night. "People have spotted him scrounging from garbage cans close to your neighborhood." Mark's mind went back. Perhaps it was just a matter of misidentification with regard to the typed letter. Fearing for their children, the neighbor called the police, who arrived and discovered an elderly shepherd in a yard and made snap judgments about a terrible misunderstanding. He thought, internally relieved that Duke didn't appear to be the target of any bad purpose, but also filled him with fear. Can cause people to react rashly, so show sympathy for the person who wrote that letter. Mark proposed that a small group of neighbors who had been talking about the problem cooperate after he sent them an email with an update. Keep a lookout for the stray dog and consider contacting a local rescue organization to help find a humane home for it. To Mark's amazement, within a few hours, his inbox was filled with residents who were not afraid or shocked. "Count me in if we can put up a human being," Miss Flanagan stated in her encouraging responses. "We can assist another neighbor, Mr., by trapping it or simply providing it with food in a secure location." The neighborhood was keen to prevent repeat incident, so Leonard volunteered to install a motion-activated camera close to his trash cans. Disaster, Peter from the shelter contacted them and shared that they had found a puppy that matched a family in a nearby town had reported stray's description lost months prior, so he sent a granny. The dog in the picture is a huge shepherd mix with tattered fur and worried eyes. Scout reportedly escaped from a boarding home after being owned by a single mother who had to move for work. Desperate, the mother plastered flyers, but no one seemed to notice. That same day, Mark showed the Miss Flanagan, and a few others nodded resoundingly when they saw the photo. It appeared just like the cat that prowled their alleys. Could Scout have accidentally found herself living in their suburb? Rubbish. The thought made Mark feel bad. Instead of calling the dog dangerous, "We should help him," the neighbors said. Lethal action is not always the solution, even while fear is real. That afternoon, Mark was startled by a tap on his door. Taking him out of his reverie, he opened it and saw one of the officers who had approached Duke Knott. The shorter cop, who appeared more nervous that day, looked apprehensive but determined, unlike the big Mike Stern one. "The officer said to take off his cap when we received the call, and I want to sincerely apologize regarding a dangerous dog, but I see that we reacted too strongly in your yard, which was never." Although Mark's rage faded, he appreciated the fact that sometimes we react too violently to a perceived threat. He asked the officer to come in for a quick talk in an effort to show sincere regret. Providing coffee as Duke watched from his position on the rug, the officer admitted that the police force had been high alert for dangerous canines that roamed the streets following a previous event in another district led us to draw hasty assumptions. Said, looking at Duke, "I'm really sorry." After a moment, Mark revealed the rumor about the actual stray dog Scout, and the strategy to safely trap him. The officer's eyes glowed with curiosity. I can connect you with animal control. Perhaps we can set up a secure trap. They spoke deep into the evening, creating a new understanding where formerly we didn't want to see any dogs be wounded. Mark was simply resentful because he now saw an officer who was willing to assist remedy mistakes and express sorry for them. Officer Duke observed from the door, his tail waving softly as though he sensed that the tension had subsided that evening. Once more, Mark sat in the backyard and looked at the star-flecked sky Duke that was lying next to his. The typed note, the suspected stray, and the foot muzzle laying on Mark's shoe. The sorry police and the helpful neighbors all suggested that there was a prospect for significant improvement, at least in. He saw this area of the suburb as an opportunity for cooperation to replace violence and for compassion to overcome fear. Observe how everything transpired over the next few days. But for the time being, he rubbed Duke's ears and felt the elderly dog sigh happily and gave himself a glimmer of hope. But maybe the most significant realization was that when confronted with miscommunication and anxiety, people could nevertheless choose to be decent, closing the gap between callers, wary police, and a community that cherished their dogs. Duke dozed off, slept soundly, perhaps daydreaming about a future in which an elderly dog would never again be tormented in his own backyard. Mark Winter's living room floor was flooded with light, illuminating Duke as he lay there in a warm spot. For the first time in weeks, old Shepherd Mick slept comfortably, his legs twitching as though he were chasing a dream squirrel. Mark had a glimmer of hope that perhaps their peaceful existence could resume, but only this time with a fresh feeling of purpose and goodwill cooperation after the police officer's apologies and the stray's disclosure. Dog's real identity, Scout Mark, became the focal point of a thriving community project. A little. Miss Flanagan, Mr. Leonard, and a few other residents gathered in. They discussed ideas to hold a sort of unofficial town hall in Mark's lawn while sipping cold lemonade and folding chairs. I talked to a rescue organization, and Miss Flanagan said, "Safely capture Scout before he gets into more trouble." Emma waved at her. "They are eager to lend us a humane dog trap, and if we can entice him with food, they will come get him." Mr. Leonard, leaning on his cane, nodded, "And we also have him until the owner from that other town could be reached." Surprisingly, the cop who approached Duke offered to assist, but I assume he feels awful because he gave Mark a heartfelt glance. He's happy to see some positive outcome from that fiasco. Looking down through his hair at Duke, who looked drowsily at the others, seemingly asking, "Are we having another crisis?" "I'm in," Mark remarked quietly, "because it means that no more dogs will be misidentified and harassed." He hoped that by apprehending Scout, the uncertainty that had almost cost Duke his peace the next day would be resolved. Officer Reed, the same regretful officer, called Mark and apologized for. Discovered the misunderstanding regarding Duke. "We received notification from Animal Control that they would like us to help with the setup of the. If Scouts are still hiding around your block, set up a trap there." His tone was businesslike, yet flavored with a personal note, as if he felt obligated to provide Mark with a suitable resolution. Mark concurred, but he couldn't help but think of how, just recently, he became agitated at the sight of a patrol car close to his. Ironically, these same officers would now stand watch over a puppy in need in the yard. He was aware of his shift in dynamic that night, as a small crew gathered behind him. When Scout sightings were confirmed, they set up a big humane trap in Mark's garden fence, a metal enclosure with. Mrs. Flanagan provided leftover roast and a drop door that would close after the dog entered. One of the rescue volunteers described the chicken as bait, placing on a paper plate, explaining that he's probably hungry and we must get him to enter voluntarily if he is apprehensive of others before we can safely carry him. Duke being kept at a safe distance. He may have understood they were doing something linked to dogs, but he was unable to fully understand it as he observed in mild uncertainty. Mark gave Duke a head pat. "Don't worry, buddy. We're making sure nobody makes a mistake." Officer Reed stood by, periodically flashing a flashlight down the alley if we couldn't get the dog for you again. He stated that we would try to catch him tonight and tomorrow, but based on what we've heard, he usually patrols these trash cans after midnight as volunteers took turns looking out as the sun sank out windows or hiding close to the trap. Mark even set up a backup camera to watch the scene from his phone. This mission felt oddly unifying the area at night, reminding us of the good old days when neighbors came together too. Around 11 p.m., they did, in fact, protect their own. The phone of Mark rang with a scout saw a slender figure creeping down the alley after receiving a motion alert from the camera. Heart thumping, Mark hurried outdoors to meet Miss Flanagan and, from a reasonable distance, they observed Reed behind the fence as the dog sniffed the air, clearly hungry, but the stray moved cautiously forward, its low ears and snout twitching at every little. For an instant, it sounded as though he had entered the trap, but then a far-off automobile. Scout fled into the darkness as the door banged, and Reed sighed in frustration as the drop door sounded. He spooked Weck, so Miss Flanagan shook her head. Try again tomorrow or the following evening, she whispered. They broke down the bait, leaving the trap with fresh food in it, occasionally catching tired. It could take days or even weeks. Mark got a call the next afternoon. She identified herself as Linda from a nearby town and posted about a missing dog named Scout. I heard that your team is attempting to capture a large shepherd mix. Could it be my Scout, who ran away months ago? Her voice was full of energy. Linda almost sobbed as Mark recounted the sightings and the approximate size and color of the coat, with both hope and concern. Relief that it was her dog, HEK, who was presumably afraid, as she claimed he was always. Hesitant around strangers, especially men. But if you tell me where I can come help, I'll come. And if Scout recognized Linda's scent when Mark made plans for her to travel over that evening, perhaps the stray wouldn't run away that night. When the neighbors rearranged, Linda showed up in a battered automobile with an old blanket. Scout would sleep on the plan, which was to simply line the trap with a blanket so that Scout would feel safe and secure. Was evident, and Mark experienced a similar feeling of unease as he wondered if today would be the night they saved the poor stray. When the group got back together, Duke slept inside the home, protected from another watcher's night and possible conflict. Off-duty Officer Reed then appeared in civilian attire, eager to complete the task, and they resumed their positions. Just before midnight, there was a rustle in the brush and cameras rolling, hearts thumping. Scouts are approaching Linda, who is crouching behind a trash can with her breath trembling. As soon as Scout scented the blanket scent, the dog's posture changed and his coat and eyes shone cautiously. A silence descended upon the watchers as they changed from alarm to unsure curiosity. Linda gently referred to Scout Boy. Are you her? Be cautious not to make abrupt movements. The dog's ears perked up and froze when the voice was filled with emotion. Scout took a shaky step forward repeatedly, indicating that he was familiar with the blanket. Tail quivering in bewilderment, but in acknowledgement, a low whimper escaped him. With Linda's tears trickling down her cheeks in a heartbreakingly transparent way, allowing Scout to fully get her scent before the stray, who was no longer a stranger, found the courage to move forward. As they drew nearer, the watchers held their breath, and Linda's hand trembled. Scout kissed her palm, and the group fell silent in awe of the dim. The dog finally gave in to being gently urged into the open cage by moonlight, and the drop door slid down with a click. But this time it was the indicator that Scout was at last safe rather than the sound of confinement. Linda wailed. Even Officer Reed watched with misty eyes as she gently pushed her hand through the bars to rub his matted fur. Mark's realization that, but for the misplaced call, Duke's suffering and Scout's rescue were directly related. Duke was on the verge of problems because the community might not have united to save the actual stray fade in. Mark breathed a sigh of relief after realizing that their strange detour had taken them here. Duke's innocence had been established, and another dog that was scared and misunderstood would now feel grateful. Make his way back to a loving family. Scout's capture had provided much-needed peace to the locals who had eagerly watched the outside every night in case the stray may eventually leave trash crumbs or allow their dogs to go. The yard without dread, despite the fact that the tale of Duke's. The story of how a real stray named Scout was eventually located after being misidentified as a deadly dog was making the rounds in the local media. Previously silent neighbors were suddenly exchanging updates on both pets throughout the day over fences. Following Scout's capture, Linda, the dog's previous owner, arrived to retrieve him from the nearby rescue. A small group of. In the lobby of the rescue center, Volunteers and neighbors gathered to watch Linda approach the weary, frightened shepherd. Then, she squatted down and whispered his name. When Scout recognized her scent, there was a noticeable gasp. Linda thanked Mark and the others who had tried to assure Scout's safety, her eyes glistening with reluctant wags of tears. She revealed that when I lost him, I was desperate and chose to keep him around until something worse occurred. Thought he would come all the way here and unintentionally cause so much difficulty. Mark gave her a hearty handshake, but no. He thought about Duke trembling amid the trouble. But I'm simply relieved that we were able to work it out before the police or someone else made a mistake. The backyard and how nearly tragically the whole thing had ended. Detective Reed, the apologetic officer, intervened to watch Mark as he led Linda through the rescue center, tasked with investigating the last aspects of the stray dog case. After witnessing the emotional reunion of Linda and Scout, it became evident to Mary that Reed wasn't the heartless enforcer some may have given the impression that he had been acting appropriately throughout the altercation in the backyard, albeit too violently. Initially, it's satisfying to see a nice ending, Reed said almost to himself. Mark heard the comment and nodded, saying softly that it would be best to not corner an elderly dog who had done nothing wrong. Ascribe blame, but to demonstrate their progress. Reed grimaced back, I'll never forget that day he confessed, so I suppose we all learned. For his part, Dookie Y had gained some local notoriety for the tale of how an old dog came. A local TV station had reported on a police fiasco and how it resulted in the rescue of a real stray. Mark hesitated when a reporter arrived at his front door in the afternoon, cameraman in tow, gently asking for an interview. He wasn't sure whether he wanted the attention, but after glancing at Duke, who was happily sleeping, he understood that flashing others may benefit from shedding light on the problems with misidentifications and the danger of overreactions. Avert similar situations in the brief interview that Mark had to explain. How nearly Duke was harmed by officers who were frightened or hostile due to a call that didn't specify the right dog. He emphasized how crucial it is to confirm complaints and handle pets and their owners with. When asked what he thought would change, Mark replied, I'd like folks to ask, demonstrating empathy before intensifying the situation. Soon after Captain Ellis from the local police station arrived, they asked questions first and let fear take a back seat. Out to Mark, who wanted to develop a brief officer training module that covered fundamental K9 body language and suggested actions to follow up on calls pertaining to dogs that we cannot rely on exclusively. Out-of-date procedures, Ellis stated over the phone. Your story with Duke put Mark embraced the notion of highlighting how simple it is to draw conclusions. Please let me know if you need my or Duke's assistance. AS cops taught how to read a dog's body language. He imagined Duke standing in a station briefing room, ancient tail wagging, posture distinguished between a growl and a whine. The mental picture made him feel better. Detective Reed also appeared to be taking a tiny step to make sure no other submissive pet wound up confined and scared. Interested in this, he confided in Mark in private. I'd feel better if the next time we use a more composed approach when handling canine complaints, since nobody wants a catastrophe. Misty Flanagan planned a weekend as a show of solidarity based on her conscience. Yes, the same location where Duke's ordeal started, the neighborhood dinner in Mark's backyard. But the atmosphere was very different. Now, children were playing. The picnic table was piled high with homemade food, and the fence was adorned with ribbons. Officer Reed stopped by off-duty to greet Duke, who was lying on a blanket while the elderly drank iced tea. They were happily enjoying the social buzz outside the porch, and whenever someone new came, they would kneel down and offer. One of them, Linda, arrived with Scout in tow and gave her soft pats or ear scratches. Despite being on a leash, the two dogs were considerably calmer than previously, and Duke gave a low woof as though Mark welcomed the younger dog into his territory as the sun set, creating long shadows on the yard. Looked about at the mixed audience, neighbors talking, kids laughing, two dogs, one. The irony was not that both of them were once lost and now laying comfortably beneath the same sky. He failed to see that a very annoying mistake had brought them all closer together without that grievance. Might not have come together to save Scout or encourage the police to reconsider their approach to handling dog-related calls. Mark bent down to massage Duke's muzzle gently, and the dog's hazy eyes glowed with satisfaction that we did all right. Duke answered with a gentle huff, moving to rest his chin on Mark's knee and whispering, "Didn't we all, boy?" There was silence in the yard as people were packing away their leftovers. Laughter and conversation subsided to gentle whispers. Others hovered around Mark's chest, which was filled with thankfulness despite dread, and, as the nighttime lights flashed on, a new sense of compassion and collapsing had emerged. Mark believed that Duke's story had opened doors in a little but significant way of compassion, good neighborliness, and improved training for officers who might react differently to the next dog complaint. In the formerly hostile backyard suddenly radiated a warmth of acceptance, demonstrating that even in the face of good people and good dogs can guide a ship clear of errors and scare tactics. Community in the direction of harmony and compassion. Autumn leaves whirled throughout Mark Winter's backyard, the same area that had witnessed a great deal of turmoil only a few weeks prior to Duke, the senior shepherd mix, carefully making his way across the grass, cautious and thoughtful at every turn, as though recalling that he had already been cornered here by police who thought he was a harmful dog, but those times seemed far away. But the neighborhood picnic and the rescue of the although life as a true stray scout had nearly returned to its leisurely pace. Despite the newfound tranquility and goodwill among people, Mark couldn't get rid of a subtle undercurrent of worry about the whole. Even when an officer apologized, the police fiasco felt unresolved. The neighborhood had united, and the department had promised to change the way they respond to animal reports. But was it? Mark was sufficiently concerned that if another false call was received, or if old canines like Duke might still be in danger, according to a different team of officers that responded. Duke occasionally stopped and blinked as he caught himself looking over his shoulder whenever a patrol car drove by the area. At the location, seemingly remembering the day when uniforms broke into his sunny nap spot, Mark, I would take a deep breath and tell myself, they know better now. We all do. However, the sense of vulnerability persisted. One clear afternoon, Mark got a call from a local. A positive voice from the animal shelter identified herself as Melissa, the coordinator of community engagement at the shelter. After learning about Duke's trauma and Scout's rescue, she decided to work with Mark on a little area-wide awareness campaign that might include a brief presentation about dog-friendly policing using the recently retrained officers' gates on bridging the gap, demonstrating to people that not all dog-related complaints need to conclude in a hurry. We would love to have Duke participate if he feels comfortable serving as a kind of ambassador for older pets, and perhaps the idea that the police department could send one or two officers to talk about what they found made Mark's heart sing. Stop another dog from experiencing the same amount of stress that Duke did. It was worthwhile. He concurred, envisioning a day filled with booths, flyers, and perhaps even a small class on interpreting canine body language, as long as the Duke isn't overpowered. Exactly a puppy these days. Mark contacted Officer Reed, the police officer who had expressed regret following that phone call, and then assisted Scout in determining whether the department would previously take part in the event. Reed was surprisingly eager that we've launched a new rookie training segment on. He told us over the phone that we might be able to give a quick demonstration showing how to approach a dog in order to handle pet calls. Employ a composed, non-threatening stance. Therefore, I still believe it's a fantastic idea, Reed informed Mark that not all cops shared this opinion, with some believing the department had received unjust criticism for merely carrying out their duties, and they may interpret a situation as a coerced apology. Mark sighed, remembering the tense moments during the potluck when some people in uniform had hovered with reserved expressions if it. A week later, he added, it's worth a try if it helps even a few officers or neighbors. For the first time since filing his informal complaints, Mark went to the precinct in person. As soon as he entered, he noticed a faint silence fall as other officers identified him as the dog man and gave him sympathetic or inquisitive looks. Maybe they remember the local news coverage or the public outcry that followed Duke Spotting's incorrect identification. Reed replied, grateful you came, as Mark nodded amiably near a bulletin board. He took out a piece of paper announcing the outreach event, and we recently had a discussion about it. He shook hands. Potential examples of a calm method for interpreting dog signs and confirming covers in detail and elucidating the distinction between a dog that is actually hostile and one that is merely parking in a bar. Mark looked over the list nervously, a tiny smile appearing on his face. It would be beneficial if we had. With this knowledge in place, he trailed off weeks ago so as not to stir up pessimism. But Reed grudgingly nodded. We wouldn't have traumatized your old friend that same afternoon if we had completed the thought for him. Considering the dog's recent trauma, Duke is getting a regular geriatric checkup at the vet. Dr. Menendez, the longtime family, appeared wise that Duke's weight and heart rate hadn't decreased, which was a relief. He's a tough old boy, Dr. Menendez patted. Despite having a few sleepless nights due to worry, Duke's flank is holding up physically. Just keeping. Mark released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, so he's ready for a brief public appearance. If it's not too overwhelming, the veterinarian laughed at the occurrence in a few days. Keep an eye out for signs of exhaustion, and let him lie down if he wants to, as Mark departed. When his phone buzzed in the veterinarian's office and showed an unknown number, he paused before answering a woman's voice. She paused nervously and then, "Hello, I'm the one who wrote you that letter." For the first time, the mother who called the police about a violent dog named Mark froze with a thudding heart. Straight to her, "Aya," he managed, "and I'm grateful that you reached out," she said with a loud sigh. "I sincerely apologize that my children were frightened by a large dog in the alley. And I suppose Duke matched the description. I never anticipated the police officers may be so violent that I want to see him personally apologize." Mark's voice trembled with remorse as mixed emotions erupted in his chest. Relief of empathy, "Okay," he replied softly. "If you truly desire, we can meet. Duke's older, but he's amiable, so I'd like to set up a meeting at Mark's yard to settle things up." Ironically, the scene of the when Asco made him anxious. Would she be distant or would she actually show regret and provide an explanation for how the neighborly potluck got out of hand? Ignored the call's origin, and although many assumed it was the new family on the block, confirmation was missing that day. Mark found himself commuting between the outreach program of the shelter and this private meeting. Tension and wary optimism that, if this mother really didn't mean to hurt, perhaps bridge their miscommunication might finally put an end to Duke's suffering. Ms. Flanagan, providing moral support if necessary after receiving the news. And if she tries to place the responsibility on you once more, we'll to set the record right. She added a wink to Duke, who continued as though nothing had changed. He would spread down in a sunbeam, nap, and occasionally walk without being disturbed. Mark waggled his tail toward the fence to welcome onlookers, patting his old friend's flank and finding solace in the, "We'll get through this final chapter, buddy," he thought, maintaining his unwavering composure. Given that the sun was hanging low over Mark Winter's garden, he had consented to meet the young mother who had called him anonymously that afternoon after she had misreported Duke as a dangerous. On the phone, she had only briefly introduced herself as Michelle. Her voice tight, but Ernest was now standing. Officers had previously cornered Duke's who and him along the fence while he was attempting to stabilize his breathing. Duke, for his part, didn't miss the irony and stayed inside the house for. Although Mark wanted him close by, he wasn't going to push the senior shepherd mix into yet another tense situation. Mr. Leonard and Misty Flanagan had offered to be there if tensions were high. Detective Reed was discreetly positioned in their yards, ready to intervene or offer moral support, just in case. Also knew about the meeting, but he had respectfully declined to go in uniform, relying on Mark to manage it. Unless anything went awry, a silver vehicle rolled up in front at exactly 4 o'clock. A woman in her early 30s came out of Mark's residence, looking around anxiously as Mark waited at the open gate while she closed the car door, wearing a sweatshirt and holding a little purse close to her side. He nodded courteously to Michelle, who softly replied, "Yes, that's me," with a hesitant smile. Her eyes shifted to the area of yard behind Mark, as though she was half expecting to see when she saw no evidence of Duke, the scary dog from the report, relaxed her shoulders. Mark provided a brief introduction, and they exchanged minor niceties. Mentioning Duke's condition and pointing to the chairs in the yard, Michelle saw the meticulously manicured grass and modest, her eyes laden with grief, and then she said nothing. That appeared to hold everything. "I apologize for how things worked out. Mark, settle into the folding chairs. Observe Michelle's agitated posture, bouncing knees, and twisted fingers of the strap of her purse. She took a breath and then stated in, I just moved here a few months ago, and my kids kept noticing a big dog howling violently near the alley. I was alarmed and asked my neighbors, but no one seemed to know who owned it. She called the police in a panic, her voice shaking with lingering guilt. Mark nodded, remembering how that stray scout used to wander the alleys. You reported a large, dangerous dog to the officers arrive and discover my former Duke rather than the actual stray, and Michelle's cheeks flushed as she shrugged, allowing the recollection of that encounter to speak for itself. I never meant for them to behave that way. I thought they would simply look about and perhaps speak with the proprietors. Then I heard that they had traumatized everyone by cornering an elderly dog, and the rumor quickly spread. And I wrote the letter to Mark with my arms folded because I felt terrible. I can feel the frustration and empathy swirling inside him, loosely across his chest. He said softly, Why are you afraid for your children? But the officers didn't take it coolly, and Duke was restrained. Hune has essentially been harassed and has never felt the same around strangers in uniform. I like that he took a moment to process that. Although your apologies is greatly appreciated, Michelle's eyes were filled with tears. I read in the news about your dog's age-related arthritis and how it broke. I sincerely hope you will pardon me. I had no idea it had blown up. My heart is shaking in his own yard. Like that, feeling happy to see Mark's posture soften as she wiped her cheeks, sensing that the chat would be beneficial. Would you like to see Duke after meeting the dog in question, Rose? I believe it could help you see him for what he truly is, a kind elderly man. Mark opened a rear door and called softly as Michelle swallowed and nervously nodded. Duke, hurry up, buddy. A bit later, Duke walked forward, waving his tail. He sniffed the air as he padded across the threshold at half-mast, pausing when he saw a stranger. Unsure, but Mark gave him a comforting shoulder rub. It's okay, boy. Michelle's eyes opened at. The dog is not all what I had in mind, as evidenced by his slow gait and graying muzzle. Duke put out a hesitant palm and leaned down to give a cautious lick, causing tears to prickle it. She murmured to Duke, I can't believe the police thought you were a threat. Her eyes once more full of. Miss Flanagan and Mr. Leonard exchanged a relieved look of regret behind the gate, glances overhearing the quiet discussion without yelling or blaming. The mother's repentance was sincere, and Mark's capacity for forgiveness was reflected in the quiet tone of. After their conversation, Z's sense of finality spread across the yard, something Mark had secretly longed for since. I wish I had just knelt down and let Duke sniff her face that day before gently massaging his ears that asked around and knocked on doors, learning that you had an older dog, and she groaned in anxiety. Causes people to act rashly. We assume the worst when we read about dog attacks on the news, and Mark crouched next to. They put a hand on Duke's back. Sometimes we fail to distinguish between perceived and actual threats. The stray who was frightening your children was actually a missing canine who was simply hungry and disoriented, told in brief how they had located Scout and brought him back to his owner Michelle. His eyes glowed with amazement and regret, wonder at the happy ending of the story, regret how dread made things worse. Mark smiled slightly and said, I'd like us to move forward, maybe help. Inform neighbors to speak with one another before calling 911 or to confirm dog reports. I can't change. Michelle nodded firmly. What happened? But we can avoid future misunderstandings. Maybe I can speak, she said. Inform the new residents of our neighborhood about the local shelter and rescue services. We don't need to rely on extreme measures. Steps before departing, Michelle found the strength to softly place a palm on Duke's head once more. I'm so. The dog blinked its tail and gave a slight wag, as if to accept her apology. Mark. Sorry, Duke, she whispered, her voice quivering, led her to the gate, his shoulders becoming less tense, and he couldn't blame her for wanting to safeguard her kids, but as the gate closed behind them, at least they could now relate to one another on a human basis. Mark. Michelle, Mrs. Flanagan smiled broadly as she peered over the fence, smiled and said everything was okay, confirming Duke's apparent sense of the environment. Mark collapsed upon a happy huff. who appeared relieved to see so many possible dangers turn into friendship. Duke jumped up on the couch next to him, and an elderly dog who had once again discovered his yard devoid of hostility or confusion. Instead of the memory of that day disappearing, it was laid to rest by respect for one another, a mother's repentance, and, as the evening sunshine danced over the living room, it became clear that empathy could overcome fear. Floor Mark was silently appreciative that Duke could now enjoy his twilight. Years with harmony, and perhaps even some new acquaintances in the weeks after Michelle's sincere apologies, the atmosphere in the neighborhood around Mark Winters was virtually revitalized by discussions concerning that ancient. Gradually, the daily banter replaced the dog Duke and the stray named Scout, concerning gardening or the forthcoming school festival. But even as every day, nobody wanted the quiet resolve that smoldered in the community when life calmed. Another helpless puppy or owner to go through what Duke had. Detective Reed, who had become familiar with the problem, kept his promise to enhance police handling of. One afternoon, he contacted Mark for an unexpected animal complaint. Invitation. We are hosting a brief phone explain training session for new hires at the precinct. I would really appreciate. Let them meet a true older dog in the area if Duke is willing to come. It could open their eyes. Mark paused to read canine behavior before drawing conclusions, imagining Duke in a room full of strangers in uniform. But the more he considered it, the more logical it seemed. They won't assume the worst the next time if we can show them how nice and peaceful an elderly dog can be. So with A, Mark agreed, feeling a combination of pride and residual anxiety, and they scheduled a date for the next week. Worried about Duke's comfort, Mark scheduled a quick visit with a veterinarian to make sure the elderly shepherd mix was fit enough to go on a trip. Dr. Menendez greeted them warmly at the police station and gave Duke a tour, examining his joints, heart rate, and any indications of tension. The veterinarian appears to be in good health, remarked, scratching behind Duke's ears. Keep your visit relatively short, because he may become a little nervous around too many new people. Brief, and allow him to rest if he exhibits any symptoms of exhaustion. Mark released a breath of relief. We'll keep it quick and use only enough words to have a favorable effect. It became known among the neighbors Duke and Mark were heading to the precinct for a special demonstration. Ms. Flanagan praised the concept and enthusiastically clapped her hands. I wish I could have seen the rookie's expressions, she said. Meanwhile, Mr. Leonard smiled. Perhaps this would deter them from realizing that not all deadly dog calls are genuine. Shrieking at every stray bark and jumping fences, including Michelle, the mother who initially caused the fiasco and gave support, saying in a low voice to Mark, "You're doing a good thing. I'm glad to." Observe the police acting to gain knowledge rather than increasing their violence on the day of the protest. Mark placed Duke into his vehicle, making sure he had a comfortable blanket and drink treats for the patrol roll cars, and a few inquisitive bystanders filled the station's parking lot. Elderly dog Reed, the visitor detective, greeted them warmly at the door. He gave Duke a little pat and added, "Thanks for coming. We have a briefing room set up." A small group of young officers waited inside, some of them exchanging doubtful looks while others were open. Curiosity, a projection screen in front of them showed slides that animal sounds that differentiate real dangers from false identification, gave Mark a nagging feeling that anxiety, but it vanished as soon as he saw Duke wagging his gray tail. Reed gave a brief account of the backyard incident before introducing Mark and Duke. How an overzealous reaction based on a false assumption traumatized an aging dog who wasn't a threat. When they saw how frequently such errors could occur, some recruits were uneasy. Mark illustrated Duke's indicates that the dog may bark at a stranger because of his comfortable stance, which includes his tail mid-height and ears not pinched back. Observe his body language. No teeth baring, no lunging. He's just an elderly man. Mark then acted out the scene of a police approaching as he was defending his yard. Duke flinched, looking uncertainly at the uniform as he heard command shouted fast. Mark said, "That's how we met." With a rural smile, a few recruits laughed quietly, but their smiles were loaded with Reed, feeling guilty, added to numerous calls to confirm the dog's conduct prior to escalating is essential. Snarling hackles and rigid posture are examples of true aggressiveness. However, if all If you notice a shaky or perplexed dog, speak quietly, maintain non-threatening body language, and always verify the dog's health, because elderly canines sometimes aren't able to sprint or attack, as you might think a hand would fly up from a young officer in the back row with a buzz cut, sir. What if we can't determine whether the dog is Mark? Gently encouraged Duke to approach the dog and sniffed. But might it still be hazardous if he was really elderly or was just acting submissive? Although you can't always be certain that Mark acknowledged it, the officer's extending handtail was giving a hesitant wag. Why do you approach this elderly man cautiously rather than aggressively? He can hardly trot across the yard, let alone mount an assault. A brief moment of observation can provide a lot of information. The officer gave Duke a gentle pat on the neck. I see what you're saying, he whispered, and the room's tension eased as more recruits approached Duke. They realized that the dog's gentle disposition was obvious once you looked past him. Following the demonstration, Reed's first bark were huge dog stereotypes, closed by reminding everyone that empathy and training go hand in hand, and that we are not advising them to lower their defenses. We strongly advise you to make decisions based on the facts rather than fear or Mark Fay, feeling a mixture of pride and relief, thanked the group Duke after a round of courteous applause. One of the rookies asked for a picture while sniffing at the edge of the briefing room, seemingly sensing the welcoming atmosphere. With him, and shortly after, 6 other people joined in taking photos of the elderly dog who had unintentionally become a local. On the way home, Mark looked at Duke in the rearview mirror as an example of innocuous misidentification. We've gone a long way, Buddy, Mark thought from fear in the old shepherd mix's sleeping muzzle reclining on a pillow. The day's struggle for comprehension and instruction had been a minor triumph, demonstrating that hearts and habits could change when individuals become more empathetic. But Mark was aware that not all the matter would be resolved amicably. But if more police officers had taken the time to determine whether additional neighbors had stopped before submitting dubious reports, maybe fewer elderly dogs and families would experience the anguish Duke had acknowledged that it was only the beginning. And for Mark, that was sufficient hope to keep them going. A gentle autumn breeze wafted the smell of rotting leaves and would smoke throughout Mark Winter's yard. Duke, an elderly shepherd mix, is sleeping by the yard fence and enjoying some last-minute relaxation. Even though things had calmed down following the police incident, there was still restlessness, and the afternoon sun hovered about the neighbors as if they were waiting for the last bit of resolution. Mark felt it too. After Duke went to the police station, the community came together in support of them, and the actual stray was reunited with its owner. Yet there was still some simmering tension beneath the surface of one crisp. Jasmine Moore, a local news reporter who had followed the incident early on, called Mark that evening, pointing out how a false complaint almost hurt an elderly dog, and now that there are rumors around regarding departmental. After the successful rescue of the actual stray Jasmine and training modifications, she requested a follow-up, which we would love to film on camera. Peace with you and Duke, she suggested Ed, and her remarkably kind tone demonstrated the favorable results. The potential modifications to dog-related calls. Mark was hesitant about the concept of cameras in his backyard unsettled him once again. Duke valued his peaceful days and didn't want the elderly man to be overly stressed by media hustle. But he then remembered how Duke's narrative had inspired real change, with neighbors participating and new police training modules being implemented. Given less anxiety of older or misunderstood canines, perhaps highlighting that with an SP spotlight was worthwhile. Inconvenience, okay, he said quietly, but keep it quiet. Duke isn't the most vivacious celebrity around. Swiftly spread the word about the impending interview. Insisting on cleaning up Mark's yard, Flanagan fussed over a few meager flower beds, joking that he would like to observe the filming from a hidden corner outside our peaceful community. Leonard Kane would draw a lot of cameras, he remarked, laughing, though some people expressed, would the finished product sensationalize the initial quarrel or accurately depict the community's unity? Mark shrugged, hoping that either Detective Reed or one of the recently hired officers would appear on video, may demonstrate genuine development. So we either believe this reporter or remain mute, he said. Flanagan, and remaining silent won't resolve miscommunications on the appointed day. Mark got up early and gave Duke a light brush, The dog put up with the fussing. Mark also laid out a cozy blanket in the yard, demonstrating patient dignity as though he was amusingly aware of his job. For the interview in the middle of the morning, Duke had a soft spot for lounge. Jasmine more showed up with a lone camera operator as. Detective Reed arrived soon after promising there would be no large production van or rowdy crew. After leaving in casual attire instead of a rigid uniform, I don't want Duke to feel intimidated by all the. He described the formal clothing with a slight smile, and Jasmine gave them a warm greeting. Praising Duke's composed manner, the dog might have remembered Reed as one of. Mark breathed, thankful that everything had gone well, and the officers who had first approached him more politely gave him a gentle tail wag. Having already relaxed, Jasmine summarized the early crisis, a misplaced complaint, and an older. She then turned to Mark about how the dog was mistakenly viewed as a threat and how the community worked to capture the real stray. Have you noticed how the neighborhood has changed after all of this? Mark looked down at Duke as he rubbed the elderly dog's ears. My innocent dog was cornered in his own yard, which initially infuriated me. But after people came forward, we located the actual stray, assisted him in getting home, and since the police department realized that additional training was necessary, Jasmine's camera has made us feel more like neighbors. The operator nodded, capturing the peaceful warmth of the yard, and then Jasmine asked a more key question. Do you think justice was served by the police? Some critics claimed that the police went too far in harassing Duke. Served, or do you still have grudges? I can't deny that I was angry, yet there was a brief moment of tightness in Mark's eyes. Detective Reed in particular, along with a few other cops, expressed regret and took action to prevent it from happening again. He cleared his throat, saying, "I'd rather see progress than carry resentment forever. We made mistakes that day that we can't undo, but we've put new procedures in place. For calls pertaining to dogs that emphasize observation and confirmation, we're also." He took a moment to consider working with neighborhood rescues to address stray issues in a more humane manner. Observing Juke during this dog's suffering made us realize how quickly fear can intensify if we don't take our time and evaluate. The interview went smoothly until someone from beyond the fence spoke up. A man's tone colored when you described how your old dad was praising a dog that shouldn't have been threatened in the first place. Mark was frustrated to see that he was Mr. Chandler, a neighbor on the opposite block. Known for his direct views, he walked closer with his arms folded. I understand that you're attempting to make things better, yet the possibility of a pet dying makes this not worth greater responsibility. The camera swung around. Mark tensely recorded the altercation as he remembered Chandler's vehement tirades in a local forum, but he was also aware of the man's worries. Reed raised his hands in a non-confrontational gesture that day, and we did fear a more disastrous ending. Understand your worry, sir, which is precisely why we're here to acknowledge our mistakes and make amends. Chandler sighed. We'll see a detective. We wish to avert terrible events. There was an uncomfortable pause as he turned and stomped out, using cheaper marks. Mark and Jasmine shared a tense look behind him. Would the camera use this tension as proof that the department hadn't gone far enough? Jasmine, who could feel the tension, moved getting the conversation back on course. She inquired about Duke's daily schedule and health before ending the interview with an hopeful perspective. Would Mark or Duke participate in upcoming neighborhood gatherings to encourage improved neighbor-officer interactions? Without a doubt, Mark stated if Duke's will support any endeavor that cultivates empathy, since we've witnessed the serious harm that may result from miscommunication and fear. But as the camera panned in on Jasmine, we also witnessed how empathy and modesty can unite a community. Grinned and said, "I'll incorporate the sincerity I've seen here in a balanced piece," she informed Mark. After the conversation was over, Mark knelt next to Duke and scratched beneath his boots, making it difficult to see actual steps rather than simply chatter. "Good job, buddy," he muttered, to clear up any remaining doubts. Duke yawned together, glad to relax by the garden fence once more, indifferent to the whirl of human politics. When Mark and Duke's local news program aired, it caused an unexpected surge of optimism among the neighbors in the neighborhood who had just heard tidbits of the story. Watched Detective Reed's interviews, in which he admitted Duke Gray's muzzled footage, his department's errors, and Mark's sincere remarks on empathy and caution. Calm eyes and a waving tail created a clear image of this kind elderly dog who had once been so near to danger due to a single phone call and a few overly eager police officers in the week after that. When Mark saw a slight change, people approached him while he was running errands to say nice things about Dookie and praise him. Some even inquired about volunteer options in the area, and the dog and owner handled everything with grace. Ms. Flanagan asked about the new police training modules or the animal shelter, delighted whenever she repeated the part to anyone who would listen, asking if they had seen old Duke on television. What a celebrity. The complete interview, meanwhile, was made public on the station's website and swiftly went viral on social media. Comment sections erupted in admiration for Mark's composed demeanor and the police's readiness to change. Some skeptics still maintained that the tragedy was being sugar-coated, but most others praised the resolution, saying it's good to see a narrative finish without tragedy. One afternoon, a comment was posted, and an invitation came in. According to the message in Mark's mailbox from the local precinct, you are kindly invited to a brief event honoring community people who have pushed for constructive change in animal-related issues. Join us in honoring Duke Mark Winters and those who have contributed to the development of our new policies. Mark blinked at the thick card material, a range of feelings rushing through him, remembering the rage and dread, recalling that day in the backyard without ever thinking it would result in any kind of honor. He looked at Duke after a beat. She gazed back drowsily, as though to say, "That's one more event, friend. Are we up for it?" Mark whispered, "I suppose we can pull off one more ceremony on a clean sheet, since you're the true hero, buddy." On a bright afternoon, Mark and Duke reached the little courtyard of the precinct, where detectives, police, neighbors, and a few locals had set up a small podium and rows of folding chairs. Captain Ellis, who had been in charge of the precinct's internal improvements, greeted everyone with, "In a brief speech today, we acknowledge how a miscommunication served as the impetus for shift. We recognize the difficulties in answering animal calls and restate our dedication to managing them with." Detective Reed took the mic next, telling with caution, empathy, and respect how the agency implemented basic canine conduct training and open communication as a result of Duke's misidentification, using nearby shelters and communities. He then called Mark up and motioned for the elderly shepherd to accompany him. Duke then walked forward, greeted by applause and soft laughter. Cameras took shots while Mark, still a little awkward, patted Duke's. Reed, the head, gave Mark a little plaque with words of gratitude for his help in fostering. Another, more straightforward plaque honoring the compassion and understanding between law enforcement and community animals was presented to Miss Flanagan. Received recognition for organizing neighbors to assist in locating the tall, stern officer and the actual wayward scout. Mark's breath hitched when the person who had first approached Duke in the yard moved forward. He recalled the tension in that. The officer's stare now contained just sincerity, yet the man's eyes and raised voices. "Thank you for showing us," he said into the microphone voice that was broadcast around the courtyard, and he wanted to apologize once again, that we could perform better. This plaque may be a minor memento, but it signifies a significant change in our perspective. To Mark's surprise, the cop crouched down and tenderly held out a hand about these calls. The dog sniffed at Duke, occasionally wagging his tail unsurely but fearlessly. It takes a lot of courage to be humble. Mark was impressed by the gesture made by Michelle, the mother, who was among the attendees. After the ceremony, she discreetly snuck into the back row with her kids in tow, having first called the police. With a shy smile, she walked over to Mark and Duke. "I'm so glad it ended this way," she remarked, softly caressing Duke's shoulders. When Duke kissed their hands, children hovered, staring at the dog they had formerly feared. Giggles broke out, dissolving. Miss Flanagan took a candid picture of Duke while she was in the final stages of worry. The kids who used to fear a big dog and the initially doubtful officers in that moment, a palpable warmth proof, took the place of the tension that had threatened to split a neighborhood. That disagreements over refreshments may be resolved with empathy, openness, and a readiness to make amends. Mark and Detective Reed talked about the next steps while doing those K-9 training exercises in the corner of the courtyard. Reed enthusiastically stated, "We might even invite you and Duke to speak at a countywide modules for officers." Mark laughed while rubbing Duke's eyes, demonstrating to them that an elderly dog can be misinterpreted if all you see are barks. As long as the treat bowls are full and the noise level is low, Chin Heck will be content. He briefly envisioned how simple. If things had gone differently, Duke might have been shot or taken. The plaque he was holding felt much heavier. Its diminutive stature implied that it represented their near tragedy and the possibility of change. Later that evening, Mark and Duke came home and entered their peaceful home. Mark collapsed onto the couch, his feet hurting from the old dog's satisfied sigh as he settled by a blazing lamp. Standing at the ceremony, "We transformed it into a nightmare," thought our old friend. The words on the plaque shone in the warm light of the lamp in the living room's corner, transforming it into something promising. Cultivating empathy represented the path they had taken, which included a single conversation, a miscommunication, a near-tragic event, and Duke's tail beat languidly, as though it were finally a community united in compassion, confirming the idea that they had accomplished something significant. And if every elderly dog could find such protection, every misunderstood circumstances like this could make the world a little kinder. Long shadows were created across the backyard, where Duke first appeared as their soft darkness descended over the neighborhood. Experienced the terrifying incident a few weeks ago, and now those memories of Mark Winters rested on his back as the voices and shaky old paws melted into a group lesson on empathy. Looking out on his porch at the small plaque that the police department had sent him, which had wording about fostering, realizing that it was more than simply an honor. It was evidence of how one poorly timed moment may become into. Duke, the elderly shepherd mix, relaxed at Mark's feet muzzle, a long-lasting community transformation. Despite his gray heart, he exhibited no signs of trusting if he remembered the occurrence. In the distance, he only gave a happy look, as though the yard was once more the safest spot on the planet. It was typical suburbia, yet there was a sense of humor in the air as laughter drifted over a fence and a neighbor's porch light flashed on. Silent assurance that others might stop to think about the situation before calling if a dog's bark reverberated through the night. Under the direction of Detective Reed, the local police department, 911, kept improving their strategy to dog-related calls, teaching newcomers to distinguish between genuine hostility and undue uneasiness in the neighborhood at an early age. Michelle, a mother, had overcome her guilt and was now advocating for improved communication between families and at the shelter. Tales of Scout's rescue and Duke's predicament were shared as uplifting reminders that fear may give way to understanding if given the opportunity as a last token of appreciation. A small dog-friendly garden was planted at the community park's border by neighbors as a living monument to elderly pets like Duke, where both officers and families may enjoy the peace and quiet of a cherished pet. As dusk grew, Mar placed the plaque atop a picture of animals enjoying their twilight years. Side table, a light wind rustled the warm fur of Duke as he pressed his hand over it. Trees above, and he grinned at the quiet of a calm evening, even though there would always be dog complaints, misunderstandings, but maybe more people would stand up, speak politely, and try because of Duke's unjustified ordeal. Seeking clarity before dread gripped that faithful and happy old canine. Owner provided a glimpse of silent evidence that even remote regions of the world may become more compassionate when compassion and second chances overcame panic and hurry. If Duke's journey inspired you as much as it did us, please share your thoughts. Comment below if you have ever seen or perhaps assisted in preventing an animal misidentification that might have ended poorly. Please share your experiences and lessons learned. Also, remember to like for more inspirational stories where bravery and empathy mold our lives. Please subscribe to our channel and watch this video. Communities for the better. Let's continue promoting the idea that compassion and understanding can transform lives, one tail wagging at a time.